Hello, my name is Sophie and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking you through my June wrap up and my July TBR because my June wrap up is small. My July TBR is long. If you watch my weekly reading vlogs, you may know that at the end of May I tried to read the entirety of my remaining monthly TBR in 4 or 5 days. I didn't succeed, but I did manage to read 2.5 books in the time where I normally would have read one. And one of those books that I really hoped to finish before the end of the month but didn't quite make it to was The Prospects by K.T. Hoffman. This was the April Afterlight book because it was on my May TBR, and I read 70% of it in May, but the last 120 pages I read on the morning of June 1st, and I absolutely binge read them because I absolutely loved this book. I rated this book 4 stars only because I reckon the first 20 to 30% had too much baseball talk. This is a trans male romance, baseball romance, so it's a sports romance. How many times can I say baseball and sports? And I just found the baseball talk too much. I didn't understand a lot of it. I don't know if it's because I'm English and because baseball is not a sport that we understand or play over here, or if because it was just too intensely baseball, but it just went straight over my head and I found it kind of boring to listen to because I was like, okay, if this whole book is going to be this, if you need this much prerequisite knowledge about baseball to enjoy this book, I don't think I'm going to enjoy this book. But that did ease a little bit. And the other thing was, at the very beginning I found both of the protagonist characters to be incredibly flat. They didn't feel like real people, they felt very two-dimensional, but then perhaps it was intentional because as they started to get to know each other and actually talk to each other, they started to feel more real and more 3D and more in-depth as characters. But at the beginning I actively didn't care about them, and I actively just didn't believe they were real, which is a weird way to think about people who genuinely aren't real. But once the communication picked up and the actual romance started to take place, I just fell in love with these characters. Louise is the one that gives me confusion about having book boyfriend crushes, because when I think about the book boys that I love the most, they're all in gay romances, and I don't know what that says about me. Trying not to think too deeply about it, but I love Luis with all of my heart. He's an absolute golden retriever. The anxiety rep on page is so good. There's also a really good ADHD rep. I love seeing the trans insight. As someone who is very comfortably cis, the whole mentality around being trans is just something I can't comprehend, which is absolutely fine, but I like learning and seeing insights from another perspective. I hope I've worded that sensitively. I love this book, rated 4 stars, thoroughly recommend, and also this Afterlight edition is absolutely stunning. I love these edges. Then I read Guild by Raven Kennedy, which is the first book in the Plated Prisoner series. I listened to this as an audiobook. It's also on my 24 in 2024 list, so it's a very productive read all round. I managed to read it in 6 days, and I think that's mostly because I had a lot of driving and not because I was particularly enjoying the book. I rated it 3 stars. I know that it's part of a 6-book series and book 6 comes out later this year, but this book felt like it had no plot. It felt like it was all the introduction to a wider series, and it's something that I have found I have an ongoing issue with, particularly with fantasy at the moment, where a book will feel like, or a series will feel like it should be one book, but it's been split into smaller books to make it actually publishable. So rather than each book having its own plot and feeling like it has its own resolution, it's just part 1 of 6. So there's only one story going throughout the whole thing. I didn't like the main character. I found her really irritating. So with that alongside not feeling like there was any plot at all, this just felt like a very average read. The only reason I'm intrigued enough to want to read the rest of the series is because I was vaguely hooked enough by the plot, but also I'm a big fan of Greek mythology and Greek mythology retellings, and Midas is a Greek character. I'm intrigued as to the presentation of Midas as a character compared to what I understand of Midas as a character, so I'm kind of intrigued from that perspective to see where that goes. Mildly disappointing because I'd heard some really good things about this series, but I will probably read the rest of the series at some point. Not rushing to do it though. Then I read my absolute favourite read of the month, and that was Not in Love by Ali Hazelwood. I pre-ordered this on my Kindle, so I read this as an ebook. I rated it 5 stars. I absolutely enjoyed it. Absolutely devoured it. I don't know what's happening. I love the characters, I love the romance, I love the plot alongside the romance. I thought they fit really well together. The tension building was absolutely incredible. I think this is a level of enemies to lovers that feels realistic in a contemporary setting. I think it's hard to do enemies to lovers in contemporary settings because enemies, unless you're doing mafia, I think it's hard to maintain the tension and the animosity of a real enemies kind of relationship. But the situation that Rue and Eli as protagonists are in really did maintain that tension and that thin line between enemies and rivals and all of those other kind of antagonist relationships. I really liked how the plot and the romance were balanced. I thought that was done really well. The only 2 kind of comments more than criticisms that I have of this book are, one, that this is Ali's first dual perspective book, and I didn't really understand why Rue's perspective was in first person but Eli's perspective was in third. It was just a tiny bit disjointing for me. Personally, I think it would have made more sense for both of them to be in first person, but no judgment. I still thoroughly enjoyed it, so it's more of a comment than a criticism. And the other thing is that Rue is incredibly autistic coded as a character, but the word autism is never used on page, and as someone who is awaiting their own autism diagnosis, I have a lot of opinions on autism and autism advocacy, and I think avoiding using the word autism or talking about disabilities is a way of further stigmatizing those words when those words are not bad words. Those words are not scary words, they're not negative words, they're just words. And being labelled as autistic or disabled is not a bad label to have. They're just labels, they just exist. I don't know, perhaps it wasn't the intention of the author to make Rue an autistic character, but she absolutely is. I just feel like, I keep thinking like, oh, well, maybe it's just me interpreting it that way. It's absolutely not. I've seen other people talking about it. I don't understand why authors in this day and age would create autistic coded characters, and why not create just autistic characters. It wasn't a big deal breaker. I still rated the book 5 stars. I loved the autism representation, if that's what it was, but I just wish it was labelled on page. But otherwise, I absolutely adored this book, devoured it, would like to read it again immediately. And then last but not least, my battery light is already flashing, so that's fun. And last but not least, I listened to the audiobook of The Book of Two Ways by Jodi Picoult. This was an interesting read. I have soft DNF'd this book before because the prologue is so wild and then never spoken about again. Not never spoken about, but it isn't acknowledged for a very long time. So that was quite disjointing for me. But the protagonist in this character was, or used to be, Egyptologist, and the author clearly did a lot of research on Egyptology and the very specific niche of Egyptology that this PhD student was doing. Consequently, it felt a little bit info dumpy and a little bit overwhelmingly Egyptian, which is not, no, I don't mean overwhelmingly Egyptian, I just mean that there was a lot of information that was arguably not relevant to the plot and then felt overwhelming to me as a reader. Attempting to read this again for the second time, listening to it as an audiobook made it much easier to just kind of tune out to the things that I didn't think were that important. Whereas obviously that's more difficult when you're reading it with your eyes. All round, just felt that was a bit info dumpy. Initially when I was reading this, it was very much giving me 3-star vibes. I was confused about the kind of 2 plot lines and I didn't really understand what was going on, but I liked the characters, I liked the little tidbits of information that were relevant to both plot lines and the parallels of them. But I found myself getting bored before we got to the resolution. I loved the resolution. I thought that was incredibly satisfying. I loved how it all tied together and everything just slot into place in such a satisfying way. I thought it was brilliant, but it took too long to get there. I got bored before I was satisfied. So it was a 3-star, then it was 2 stars because I was boring, but then the resolution brought it up to 4. It couldn't go higher than 4 because of the boredom. I just think the pacing was a little bit off. It was just a little bit too long and a little bit too info dumpy. Just a little bit I thought it was the battery that was going to get us, but it turns out my SD card filled up, so I was cut off part of the way through talking about the Book of Two Ways. But basically, to wrap up what I was saying, I would have given it more than 4 stars, but considering it already had pulled itself from a 2-star to a 4-star, the fact I got so bored before it got to the very satisfying resolution just means I can't give it more than 4, but it was a very enjoyable 4 once we got past the boredom bit. So that is it for the June wrap up. I would have read more, but if you've been watching my weekly reading vlogs, you'll know that I started reading a non-fiction autobiography called A Sense of Freedom by Jimmy Boyle on literally June the 1st, because I was really trying to make June the month that I finished my TBR. But it is a good book and I am enjoying it, but this edition was printed in 1982 and the original book was published in 1977. And I don't know if it's something to do with book formatting at the time, but there's a lot of pages on the word. But there's a lot of pages on the word. I keep wanting to describe it as a very dense book, but not dense in the sense of the narrative style being heavy or it being difficult to read. I actually think it's quite conversational and quite easy to read, but it's a formatting thing. There is just literally a lot of words on the page. So when I think my average reading speed is probably just short of a page a minute, but with this book I can be reading for ages and have read half that much. I'm finding it really difficult to get through this book, and I can read maybe 10 pages at a time before I fall asleep at night. So I am still making my way through that one. I'm hoping to finish it relatively quickly because my July TBR is large. Right, so that's the wrap-up section done. We're going to move those books out the way, put them on the cart in the background, and then we get to the July TBR. The July TBR is perhaps a little bit out of hand. So as you may or may not know, I've been banging on about trying to make my TBRs smaller and more achievable for ages, and I thought, well, I had really achieved that in June, but then I got stuck with a non-fiction book. July seems to have reverted on that a little bit. The July TBR is 10 books long. Part of that is because I didn't get around to reading my Famous 5 book in June, so I want that to be the first thing I read in July so that I don't get too far behind. A bigger part of that is because I'm doing my first ever readathon. I've been following Gabby Reads on YouTube for a couple of years now, I reckon, and I've basically followed along with the hype of Summerween without ever taking part in Summerween. If you're not familiar, Summerween is essentially bringing Halloween to summer and reading spooky books all year round. And considering I am not someone who is a particular fan of Halloween, doesn't read thrillers and doesn't read horrors, Summerween is an odd first readathon choice. But it's more, choice feels like the wrong word because I didn't exactly choose it to be my first readathon. I just thought, oh, there's a readathon, might give that a go. But I've been a fan of Gabby, I really like her videos, and even though I don't necessarily enjoy the books that she reads, I enjoy listening to her talk about them. The thing with the Summerween prompts is that they are generally quite broad. I think there's only one really that is actually thriller and horror centric. So basically, I'm going to be taking part in Summerween this year. It starts on Friday the 5th of July and finishes on Thursday the 11th of July. I am going to Wales on the weekend of Friday 5th of July, so I will be away from home from the Friday to the Sunday, but it's a 3-hour drive to get to Wales, which means I've got 6 hours of driving that weekend. So I'm going to be reading at least one of these books as an audiobook, and I'm hoping to finish it on that drive. But either way, the prompts for Summerween are to read a book in the dark, which is obviously very broad and you can do that with any book. To read a thriller or horror book, which surprisingly I had more of those in my library than I thought, but I've managed to pick one that's also on my 24 and 2024 list, so 2 birds, 1 stone. To read a book with 5 words in the title, to read a book with a night sky on the cover, and to read a book set in the summer. So like I said, only one of those is really relevant to the thriller and horror genre, but I've managed to make 3 of them, 3 of the books that I'm going to be reading for this readathon, relevant to the prompts. I have picked a book for every prompt, but I can cover all of the prompts with less of the books as well. I'm going to take you through my July TBR. Like I've said before, I am a planner, not a mood reader, so I've put the books into the order that I'm intending to read them this month, obviously starting with that Famous 5 book from last month, which I don't have in this stack because it's on my bedside table. But the first book I'm going to be reading this month is 5 Go to Kirin Island Again, the 6th book in the Famous 5 series. I'm hoping to binge read that before I go to Wales to get it done and out the way. Then we get on to the juicy bit. The second book on my July TBR is The Thin Executioner by Darren Shan. This is my book club pick for this month, and completely coincidentally, because it was my husband's turn to choose the book club book this month, he has picked a horror book. It couldn't have timed more perfectly if he tried, but it is actually a complete coincidence. And this is the book I'm intending to read for the prompt Read a Book in the Dark. I'm putting this one at the top of my list just because if there's any chance that I get stuck and I don't get through as much of my TBR as possible, if I want to finish any book, if I finish one book this month, I want it to be the book club book. So The Thin Executioner by Darren Shan will be, after the Famous 5, the first physical book I read this month. So I will be reading it with my eyes in the dark. I've not quite figured out the logistics of that yet, but we're going to work on it. And we're going to read this book in the dark. 2 birds, 1 stone. We're trying to make reading as productive as possible because that's just who I am as a person. Then for the prompt, read a book with 5 words in the title, I've picked One of Us is Lying by Karen M. McManus, which is also on my 24 in 2024 list. Again, productive reading. 2 birds, 1 stone. Very convenient. This is the book I've picked up as an audiobook, and I will be intending to hopefully listen to all of on my way to and from Wales this weekend. The audiobook is about 10 hours long. If I listen to it at like 1.4, 1.5 speed, I should be able to get through the whole thing in those 2 drives, but if I don't, I don't. That's not the end of the world. I don't know much about this book at all, but it's a YA thriller, horror, something. I don't know. I'm hoping it gives me Holly Jackson vibes. Hopefully it will keep me entertained on my drive. One of Us is Lying, which covers my 24 in 2024 and a book with 5 words in the title. Then for my next physical read, because apparently I'm going to get through reading The Thin Executioner super fast, I'm going to be reading 16 Souls by Rosie Talbot, which is again on my 24 in 2024 list, but covers the SUMMERWEEN prompt reading a thriller or horror book. This is a YA horror. Don't think it's a thriller. There's a lot of crossover in those genres, but this is my horror book that I will be reading for that prompt for the readathon. Then moving on to the less thriller horror books to finish off my SUMMERWEEN TBR. For a book with a night sky on the cover, we have The Kiss Countdown by Etta Eason. This is the Afterlight subscription special edition. Yes, this is space, but is space not just a big night sky? I'm counting it. This is a romance book with fake dating between an astronaut and one of us normal plebs that isn't an astronaut. I don't really know, but it's a book I'm excited about. It's got a space aesthetic and I am a space aesthetic girly, so looking forward to reading this one as a book with a nice sky in the cover. And this is on my leftover TBR because it was on one of my monthly TBRs earlier in the year, so it's also like a catch-up book as well. And then last but by no means least, the 5th book that covers the 5th prompt of my SUMMERWEEN TBR, a book that's set in the summer, You and Me on Vacation by Emily Henry. Now that I've read my 2nd Emily Henry book in Reading Funny Story, I'm now going for the rest of her backlog. I know this one is arguably her least popular book, but it says summer on the back about 7 times, so I'm 99% sure this is set in the summer, so this will definitely cover that prompt for SUMMERWEEN. This book isn't on any of my other lists or TBRs, but that's fine. I'm telling myself that's fine. So that's all of my SUMMERWEEN reading. Will I get through all of that in a week? It's questionable. Really not sure. But if I haven't got through all of that by the end of next week and or by the end of the month, the next book on my TBR is my Illumicrate book for June, which is Of Jade and Dragons by Amber Chen. This edition is stunning. Absolutely stunning. I mean, look at those sprayed edges, just beautiful. And I've also picked this one up as an audiobook, so I'm hoping to be able to co-read this. I think I got The Kiss Countdown as no, I also got You and Me on Vacation as an audiobook, so I will be either listening to this while I drive or co-reading this. But yeah, I'm hoping to co-read this book. It sounds good. I don't really have anything else to say about it. That's the June Illumicrate book. It's on my July TBR. After SUMMERWEEN is done, hopefully I'll be reading this. Then my Afterlight subscription book from June is Cross the Line by Simone Sultani. This is an F1 romance, and the sprayed edges remind me of those rugs we used to play on when we were kids. If you know, you know. If you don't know, that's going to sound weird. The naked hardback of this book is adorable. I love all these little drawings. They're so cute. Then we have the famous 5 book I'm actually meant to be reading this month, the 7th book in the series, which is 5 Go Off to Camp. I have nothing more to say about this series. I'm just getting through them at this point. Since doing that challenge where I tried to read as much of my TBR as possible in the last week of May, I realised I probably can read this in a day if I really put my mind to it. So I'm relying on that and saving it for the end of the month. Then, last but by no means least, there was a delay in the Illumicrate May box. So I have the delayed May Illumicrate subscription book, which is Goddess of the River by Vaishnavi Patel. I'm 99% sure I'm pronouncing that wrong and I'm so sorry, but this is beautiful, absolutely stunning, and these edges, look at them, they're beautiful. So if I finish everything else and I manage to get around to this, hopefully I'll read this as well. But this does take the TBR up to 10 books, and that is a lot of books. So realistically, I probably won't get around to this, but if I do, it's here and ready to be read. So that is the July TBR and the order I intend to read them in, because I'm a planner, not a mood reader. So I find it incredibly satisfying knowing that when I finish a book, I know exactly what I'm picking up next. Thank you so much for watching. Wish me luck with finishing this TBR, because I genuinely will be needing it. I hope you're having a great day. I hope you're reading a great book, and I'll see you next time for another bookish video. Bye!